Airports were supposed to be an escape from HOA meetings, not another battlefield. The polished floors, the rhythmic buzz of rolling suitcases, and the smell of coffee in the air usually signaled freedom for Jake Millar, chance to disconnect from the constant HOA emails, absurd rule enforcement, and petty neighborhood politics that defined life in Maple Ridge Estates. But for 27-year-old homeowner Jake, trouble had a way of following him. It didn't matter if he was in his backyard or halfway across the world. If trouble had a name, it would be Tiffany Ward. Tiffany wasn't just any neighbor. She was the youngest HOA president in Maple Ridge's history, and she wore that title like a crown. At 29, Tiffany had the kind of confidence that came from getting her way too often. She was the type who hosted mandatory community mixers, patrolled lawns with a ruler, and believed every household should match the neighborhood aesthetic right down to mailbox color and grass height. Her manicured perfection and iron-fisted control earned her a nickname among residents, the Queen of the Cull-Day-Sack. Jake had learned early on to stay out of her path. He'd been fined once for having a non-compliant garden gnome and twice for parking too close to his own driveway. So when he finally got the chance to take a break from suburban madness, he promised himself that this flight would be about peace and celebration. After years of dedication, Jake had just been promoted to airline pilot instructor, a prestigious role that marked a major step in his aviation career. To commemorate the occasion, he'd splurged on a first-class ticket, the kind of luxury he rarely allowed himself. As he arrived at Gate 42, Jake let out a small sigh of relief. For once, everything was going smoothly. He grabbed a cup of coffee, found a quiet seat by the window, and watched planes taxi across the runway under the golden morning light. It felt like a scene straight out of a movie, the calm before the next big adventure. But peace, as Jake knew all too well, never lasted long when Tiffany was around. "Excuse me, are you Jake, from Lot 14? The voice sliced through the airport chatter like a blade. Jake's heart sank instantly. It couldn't be. Slowly, he turned toward the sound, and there she was, Tiffany Ward, standing like she owned the terminal. Her outfit screamed expensive: pearl white blazer, gold wristwatch, designer sunglasses perched perfectly atop her glossy brown hair. In one hand, she held a Louis Vuitton carry-on, and in the other, her phone no doubt open to a spreadsheet of HOA violations. "Tiffany," Jake said, half in disbelief, half in dread. "What are you doing here?" She didn't even answer his question. Instead, she looked him up and down, her lips curling into a judgmental smirk. "You didn't respond to my emails," she said matter of fact. "Your garbage bins were left out past 10 p.m. last week. We need to discuss your fine." Jake blinked, trying to process the absurdity of it. "Tiffany, I'm at the airport," he said slowly. "I'm literally flying out of the country." But Tiffany only tilted her head "Perfect," she said sweetly. "We can discuss it on the plane. I happen to be on the same flight." Jake nearly dropped his coffee. Of course, she was. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "Oh, I never kid about HOA violations," she said, flipping her hair. "You residents think the rules don't apply once you're past the gates. But the community standard is a 24/7's responsibility." He stared at her, wondering if she actually believed what she was saying, or if this was some elaborate prank. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became. Tiffany Ward truly saw herself as a guardian of neighborhood morality, even at 35,000 feet. "Tiffany," Jake said, rubbing his temple, "this is not the time or place. I'm on vacation." "Vacation," she repeated, feigning surprise. "How interesting. You didn't submit a temporary absence notice. You know we prefer homeowners to inform the board when they'll be away." Jake sighed, biting back a laugh. "I didn't realize I needed your permission to leave the country." "Well," she said, shrugging, "technically you don't, but it's recommended for security purposes. We wouldn't want someone thinking your home is vacant." He stared at her for a long moment, caught between frustration and disbelief. "You really can't turn it off, can you?" "Turn what off?" she asked innocently. "The HOA," he replied. "The rules, the control. You're acting like this airport is part of Maple Ridge?" She smiled an infuriating, condescending smile. "Order and structure are universal, Jake. That's why I succeed at everything I do. People like me keep things from falling apart." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "You mean people like you cause things to fall apart?" For the first time, Tiffany's perfect expression faltered. She straightened her blazer and adjusted her sunglasses. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that," she said stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to confirm my seat upgrade." He watched her stride to the counter with the confidence of someone who thought the world was her personal HOA. Even the gate agent looked a little taken aback as Tiffany demanded priority check-in. Waving her gold credit card like it was a badge of authority, Jake leaned back in his chair, sighing. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had left home to escape the HOA, and now? The HOA had followed him to 30,000 feet. As boarding began, Jake grabbed his bag and approached the gate, silently praying their seats were on opposite ends of the plane. But as fate would have it, Tiffany was right behind him in line. "Hope you don't mind," she said sweetly. "I'm sure first class will be a nice change from your Honda." He glanced back at her, smirking. "You'd be surprised where a Honda can take you." And with that, he handed his ticket to the gate agent and walked down the jet bridge, blissfully unaware that this flight was about to become far more eventful than either of them could have imagined. Boarding began, and Jake felt a wave of calm as he handed over his ticket. The little beep from the scanner sounded like music to his ears, confirmation that, for once, things were going his way. He'd made it through security, found his gate, and was moments away from sinking into a plush first-class seat where no one would nag him about grass height or mailbox color. But just as the gate agent smiled and handed him back his ticket, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the air like feedback from a broken speaker. There must be some mistake. Jake froze midst. He didn't even need to turn around, he knew that tone anywhere. It was the sound of HOA authority, the sound of someone about to make everyone's life miserable over something trivial. Slowly, he turned and saw her, Tiffany Ward, standing at the counter, her Louis Vuitton bag perched beside her like a loyal pet. "I always fly first class," she announced, her voice carrying across the gate area. "That's my seat to a." The gate agent, a composed woman with a patient smile that suggested she'd dealt with every kind of entitled traveler imaginable, checked the passenger list calmly. "Ma'am, 2A is assigned to Mr. Miller." Tiffany's jaw dropped as if she'd just been told her lawn was officially off-color green. "What, him? You can't be serious." Her finger shot out toward Jake. "He lives in my community. He should be in coach, where the rest of the residents sit." The entire boarding area seemed to pause. Heads turned. A businessman in a suit lowered his newspaper. A child stopped tapping on their tablet, and somewhere in the crowd, someone muttered, "Oh boy, here we go." Jake felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but it was just too surreal. Of all the people to run into at an airport, of all the possible seat assignments, he had to share a flight with the neighborhood's self-appointed dictator. Tiffany wasn't done. She straightened her blazer, her tone dripping with entitlement. "He probably used points or something. I pay full price. I deserve that seat." The gate agent gave a polite smile that was starting to strain. "Ma'am, the system shows your assigned seat as 1-B. You'll need to take that one, 1-B." Tiffany repeated, horrified. "That's," she lowered her voice dramatically. "Coach, I understand, ma'am, but we can't change seat assignments once the cabin has been finalized," the agent said gently. Tiffany scoffed. "You must not understand. I'm the president of Maple Ridge Estates, HOA. I always fly first class." A couple of passengers nearby chuckled. One woman even pulled out her phone, clearly preparing to record the encounter. The phrase HOA president seemed to trigger instant recognition, as if everyone knew what kind of chaos that title implied. Jake shifted awkwardly but couldn't help enjoying the show. "It's not the neighborhood board meeting, Tiffany," he said under his breath. "There's no voting system here." She turned sharply, lowering her sunglasses like a movie villain, revealing her eyes for dramatic effect. "You can give me the seat," she said coldly, "or I'll make sure your next HOA renewal gets lost in the system." Jake blinked, almost laughing at the absurdity. "You realize this isn't Maple Ridge, right? You don't control the airport. Rules are rules," she said proudly, "and I enforce them everywhere." The gate agent, clearly running out of patience, called over a nearby security officer. "Sir," she said to Jake with professional courtesy, "please proceed to your seat. We'll handle this." Jake nodded, gladly. He turned to Tiffany and said just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Tiffany, I don't work for the HOA, you do." That drew a few laughs from the boarding passengers. Tiffany's face flushed pink. "You're making a mistake, Jake. I know people. I can have you fined for harassment." He smirked. "You can't fine someone at 30,000 feet. The gate agent leaned forward with a smile that was polite but firm. "Ma'am, please step aside. You're delaying boarding." Tiffany crossed her arms, glaring at the growing line behind her. A few people whispered to each other, phones discreetly recording. Someone whispered, "She's really arguing about a seat?" Tiffany's voice rose another octave. "This is discrimination against homeowners who contribute to their community. Do you know how much volunteer work I do?" The gate agent gave her a tight-lipped smile. "Ma'am, this is not a matter of community service. It's a boarding issue. Please either board in your assigned seat or step aside." "Unbelievable," Tiffany muttered, snatching her boarding pass back. She turned to Jake with one last glare, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Miller. People like you don't belong in first class for long." Jake just grinned. "And people like you usually get banned from the lounge." He walked down the jet bridge, feeling dozens of eyes follow him, some sympathetic, others amused. The murmurs behind him were a blend of gossip and laughter. Snippets of HOA Karen, and you can't make this stuff up. As he stepped into the aircraft, the scent of leather seats and quiet hum of the cabin reminded him why he'd splurged for the upgrade. He found seat to a wide, comfortable, and blissfully separate from Tiffany's chaos. He placed his bag overhead and sank into his seat, exhaling deeply. But even as he adjusted his seatbelt and took a sip of water, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Tiffany Ward didn't lose battles gracefully, especially not ones that challenged her sense of superiority. He glanced toward the jet bridge, half expecting her to march down the aisle any second, lecturing him about community fairness. And as if on cue, He heard her voice echo faintly through the cabin entrance. "I'll be filing a complaint. This isn't over." Jake smiled to himself. "Oh, I'm sure it's not," he muttered. The flight attendant, catching his amused look, leaned over. "Rough start." He chuckled. "You have no idea. Let's just say my HOA president's on board." The attendant raised an eyebrow. "Oh," she said knowingly. "Then this flight's about to get interesting." Jake laughed softly, closing his eyes. He could already tell this flight wasn't just going to be memorable. It was going to be legendary. 15 minutes later, the plane was soaring smoothly through the clouds, the hum of the engines blending into a steady, peaceful rhythm. Jake leaned back in his seat, finally able to breathe. The crisp white linen, the quiet murmur of conversation, and the faint clink of glasses created a serene atmosphere he'd been craving for months. He took a slow sip of champagne and scrolled through the photos on his phone, pictures of his students during their training flights, smiling proudly beside small aircrafts on sunlit runways. It was a reminder of why he loved his job: teaching, guiding, and watching others reach for the skies literally for a fleeting moment. He forgot about Tiffany Ward, the self-proclaimed queen of Maple Ridge Estates, who was somewhere in economy class, hopefully busy criticizing the seat spacing or the shade of the cabin curtains. But peace never lasted long where Tiffany was concerned. It started with the sound of heels clicking fast, sharp, and growing louder. The kind of sound that announced chaos was coming down the aisle. Jake looked up just in time to see her, Tiffany, marching forward like she was leading a parade, ignoring the desperate whispers of the flight attendants behind her. Her sunglasses were perched dramatically atop her head, and her perfectly styled hair hadn't moved an inch since takeoff. "Excuse me?" she barked, her voice slicing through the calm like a siren. "There's been a mix-up." Every head in first class turned. One of the attendants reached out gently. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We're at cruising altitude," but Tiffany waved her off as if swatting a fly. "No, you don't understand," she interrupted. "This man," she pointed directly at Jake, "shouldn't be sitting here. I've seen his car. It's a Honda. You can't convince me he's first-class material." The entire cabin went still. Jake nearly choked on his champagne. Did she seriously just say that? The elderly man seated next to him turned, eyes twinkling with amusement. "Lady," he said, chuckling under his breath, "he's got the demeanor of a pilot. You might want to sit down before you embarrass yourself further." Tiffany's face contorted, a mix of disbelief and insult. "Pilot?" she repeated, scoffing. "Him don't be ridiculous. He's just a neighbor with too much attitude." Jake put his phone down and took a deep breath, fighting the urge to laugh. "Tiffany," he said calmly, "why don't you take your seat before this turns into another HOA hearing?" But Tiffany wasn't backing down. She folded her arms across her blazer and sneered. "This isn't about attitude, Jake. It's about standards. I pay for first class every time I fly. People like you," she gestured at him dismissively, "belong in economy. You can't just throw on a nice jacket and pretend you belong here." A few passengers exchanged glances, some smirking, others shaking their heads. One woman whispered, "She's really saying this out loud." The flight attendant, clearly at her limit, stepped forward again. "Ma'am, you're disturbing other passengers." "Please, disturbing," Tiffany interrupted. "No, I'm restoring order. You people don't understand. I have authority. I run an entire community. I enforce regulations, handle disputes, maintain decorum, ma'am." The voice that cut her off this time wasn't the flight attendant's, it was deeper, more commanding. Everyone turned to see the captain standing in the aisle, his expression calm but unmistakably firm. His presence carried a quiet authority that made even the most difficult passengers fall silent. He approached slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'm Captain Rhodes. I've been informed there's an issue." Tiffany straightened immediately, smiling like a child caught misbehaving but trying to charm her way out of it. "Oh, Captain, I'm so glad you came. Yes, there's been a mistake. This man," she said, pointing again at Jake, "is sitting in a first-class seat that clearly isn't his." The captain raised an eyebrow. "And why do you believe that, ma'am?" She laughed, exasperated. "Because he's from my neighborhood. He drives a Honda Civic, for heaven's sake. I've seen his house, it's nice, but not this nice. Trust me, he's not first-class material." The captain blinked once, then twice, as if making sure he'd heard correctly. A few passengers were trying unsuccessfully not to laugh. Jake just sat quietly, watching the scene unfold like a sitcom he'd seen one too many times. Finally, the captain exhaled. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you're causing a disturbance. I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat." Tiffany rolled her eyes dramatically. "Do you know who I am?" The captain's patience thinned. "No, ma'am, I do not." She stood taller, smiling proudly. "I'm the president of Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I oversee 236 households. I maintain community, order, safety, and standards. I think that qualifies me to recognize when someone doesn't belong in first class." The captain stared at her for a beat, then nodded slowly. "That's impressive, ma'am." He turned his gaze toward Jake and added, "But right now, you're a passenger, and this passenger," he gestured to Jake, "is our flight instructor from corporate. Auditing this route." The cabin erupted in laughter. A few passengers clapped. Someone muttered, "Oh, that's karma right there." Tiffany froze, her jaw tightening as the color drained from her face. He's what? Jake leaned back in his seat, his grin calm and measured. You were right, Tiffany, he said softly, his tone dripping with irony. I am first-class material. The elderly man next to him chuckled loudly. Guess that Honda comes with wings. Huh. Even the captain cracked a smile. Ma'am, he said to Tiffany, I'm giving you one last chance to return to your seat before we make this official. Tiffany's mouth opened, but no words came out. The realization hit her she'd just tried to humiliate a corporate flight instructor in front of the entire first-class cabin. Slowly, silently, she turned on her heel and walked back toward economy. The sharp click of her heels replaced by the soft laughter of passengers around her as she disappeared behind the curtain dividing the cabins. Jake raised his glass of champagne and murmured to no one in particular. 2 smooth flights and poetic justice. The man beside him lifted his glass in return. Cheers to that. And for the first time all day, Jake allowed himself to relax knowing that, somewhere in the back of the plane, Tiffany Ward was realizing that even in the sky, her authority had limits. When the plane finally touched down, the tension that had filled the cabin began to ease. Passengers unbuckled, stretched, and reached for their overhead bags, grateful to be back on solid ground. But for Tiffany Ward, Maple Ridge Estates' self-appointed queen, the nightmare was only beginning. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, she sprang up like she'd been launched from a cannon. Her pearl-white blazer shimmered under the cabin lights as she yanked her carry-on from the bin. Muttering under her breath about unprofessional airlines and disrespectful passengers, Jake Miller, on the other hand, took his time. He finished the last sip of his champagne, placed the glass neatly on the tray, and smiled to himself. The flight had turned into something far more entertaining than he expected, a chaotic, airborne HOA meeting where, for once, he wasn't the one on the receiving end of Tiffany's authority. Tiffany glanced back and saw him still seated. Unbelievable, she scoffed. Still lounging around like you own the plane. Jake simply gave her a calm nod. Ladies first, President Ward. That made her bristle even more. Don't mock me, Jake. I'll be filing a report about this flight and your behavior. Completely inappropriate for whatever it is you actually do. Before Jake could reply, the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we make a brief announcement. The tone was polite but serious. Tiffany paused, adjusting her sunglasses as if preparing for an award ceremony. Then the familiar voice of the gate agent from earlier echoed through the cabin speakers. Attention passengers, please remain seated while we escort one of our airline officials. Tiffany straightened up, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Finally, she said proudly, they must have realized who I am. She brushed imaginary dust off her blazer and flipped her hair with a smug tilt of her chin. But before she could take a single step forward, the gate agent appeared at the entrance of the jet bridge, clipboard in hand, scanning the cabin. Then she announced clearly, Escort the Pilot, please. Tiffany's grin widened for half a second till 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane and began walking directly toward her. The entire front row froze. A few passengers started whispering. Someone pulled out their phone, quietly recording. Wait, what are you doing? Tiffany demanded, backing up slightly. You're supposed to be escorting me VIP, first class, HOA president. The gate agent smiled pleasantly but with unmistakable firmness. Ma'am, due to multiple in-flight disturbances and passenger complaints, we've been asked to escort you for a brief conversation with airport security. Tiffany's jaw fell open. Disturbances? Complaints. This is outrageous. I didn't do anything wrong, he started it. She jabbed a finger in Jake's direction, who was now standing calmly by his seat, holding his leather flight bag. Jake chuckled softly. You might want to check your HOA bylaws. Tiffany, pretty sure disrupting an aircraft isn't covered under your presidential immunity. The passengers erupted into laughter. The elderly man from earlier clapped and muttered, now that's first-class entertainment. Red-faced and sputtering, Tiffany tried one last desperate attempt to reclaim control. You'll regret this. I'll contact your airline. I'll file complaints. But her voice was drowned out by the sound of applause as she was gently but firmly escorted down the aisle. Her designer heels clicked against the floor in sharp rhythm. The echo of her downfall. Jake followed behind a few moments later, walking leisurely toward the exit. As he stepped off the plane, the captain stood waiting by the cockpit door, offering him a respectful nod. Nice to see you again, Instructor Miller. Appreciate your feedback on today's route. The passengers who overheard gasped in realization. Tiffany, halfway down the jet bridge, froze midst. Why tour the instructor? You're that pilot. She stammered. Jake smiled, his voice calm and smooth. I told you I was flying out for work. I just didn't think you'd need it, announced. The captain laughed softly. He's one of our top evaluators. The crew was under audit today. Tiffany's eyes widened, horror flooding her face as she realized just how publicly she'd humiliated herself, not just in front of passengers, but before an airline official who outranked even the captain. Jake adjusted his blazer and glanced back one last time. Safe travels, Tiffany. Maybe next time, keep the HOA meetings on the ground. As he walked toward the terminal, applause broke out behind him. Passengers shook his hand, some laughing, some recording, all of them with one story they'd never forget. The day a power-hungry HOA president tried to boss around a pilot at 30,000 feet, and learned the hard way that authority doesn't fly everywhere. Meanwhile, Tiffany Ward, Maple Ridge Estates' once untouchable queen, was left standing in the jet bridge, her confidence deflating faster than a punctured tire. For the first time, she didn't have a rule book, a clipboard, or a fine to save her. Just a long, humiliating walk to airport security, and the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally met her match. A week later, Maple Ridge Estates was quieter than Jake Miller had ever seen it. The lawns were trimmed, the sidewalks clean, and not a single violation notice fluttered on a front door. Even the air felt lighter, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled after years of living under Tiffany Ward's microscopic watch. Jake had just returned from another round of flight training sessions, the kind of peaceful work that kept him far away from HOA politics and overly ambitious community presidents. The sun was dipping low when he pulled into his driveway, the glow of the golden hour washing over the tidy rows of suburban homes. For once, no one was measuring hedge heights or snapping photos of garbage bins. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed something new sticking out of his mailbox. It wasn't the usual glossy HOA envelope with its intimidating bold letters. This one was plain white, hand-delivered and sealed neatly. Jake frowned, half expecting another passive-aggressive note about his lawn edging. But when he tore it open and read the contents, his expression changed. It wasn't a fine. It was a resignation letter. Dear residents, it began in Tiffany's overly formal tone. Effective immediately, I, Tiffany Ward, am stepping down from my position as president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I have decided to focus on personal growth and travel opportunities. Jake blinked, reading the line twice. Personal growth and travel opportunities. That was Tiffany's speak for public humiliation recovery. He chuckled softly, leaning against his car as he read the rest. Attached to the letter was a printed email from the HOA board, thanking Tiffany for her years of service and announcing that a temporary committee would manage affairs until new elections. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was what came next: links to news articles and social media, clips that explained everything. Tiffany's in-flight meltdown had gone viral. The video, by one of the passengers in first class, had racked up millions of views under the headline, HOA Karen tries to kick pilot out of first class. Jake scrolled through the comments, trying not to laugh out loud. They were brutal, hilarious, and oddly satisfying. Imagine thinking you outrank a pilot because you run an HOA. She really tried to issue a fine at 30,000 feet. The real turbulence was her ego. Somebody tell this lady the skies aren't part of her jurisdiction. News outlets picked it up. 2 morning shows, Reddit threads, even a few pilot humor pages. There were memes of Tiffany standing in the aisle, labeled "When you try to enforce lawn rules at cruising altitude." Another had Jake's calm face with the caption, "The only pilot who's ever survived an HOA audit mid-flight." By the time Jake reached the end of the letter, he was grinning. For once, Maple Ridge Estates didn't feel like a suburban dictatorship. No more warnings about trash bins being an inch too far from the curb. No more passive-aggressive reminders about driveway oil stains or mailbox colors. Just quiet lawns, friendly neighbors, and for the first time, peace. As he walked up the path to his front door, a few neighbors waved from across the street. Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, who used to get fined for unapproved flower pots, smiled like they'd just won the lottery. Even old Mr. Henderson, who once nearly went to war over a fence height dispute, gave Jake a thumbs up. "You really did it, Jake," Henderson called out with a grin. "You grounded her?" Jake laughed, shaking his head. "Wasn't exactly my plan, but I'll take the credit." Inside his house, he tossed the resignation letter on the counter, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sank into his favorite chair. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Unknown number. He frowned for a moment, wondering if it was a telemarketer or one of his students calling from the training center. But when he opened the message, his eyebrows shot up. "Tiffany, next time you fly, save me a seat." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. He reread the message twice, just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. After all the chaos she'd caused, the arrogance, the viral humiliation, Tiffany Ward was still Tiffany Ward, still bold, still dramatic, still incapable of admitting defeat directly. He chuckled to himself. Typing a simple reply, "Jake Shuren, coach." He hit send and leaned back, laughing softly as he pictured Tiffany reading that on her designer phone, probably rolling her eyes. He could almost hear her muttering something about ungrateful neighbors. But somewhere deep down, he knew she might have smiled too. Maybe, just maybe, she'd learned a little humility at 30,000 feet. As the evening breeze drifted through the open window, Jake looked out over the quiet neighborhood. For the first time since he'd moved to Maple Ridge Estates, there were no warning letters, no HOA meetings, and no power-hungry president patrolling the cul-de-sac with a clipboard. Just peace and, maybe, for Jake, a well-deserved sense of victory. He raised his coffee mug toward the sunset, a small toast to himself and the long-overdue calm that had finally landed back home. "Here's to clear skies," he murmured, smiling, "and HOA free flights."